Hello, everyone. My name is Leanne. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the programming manager here at the Barrick Museum of Art. Thank you all for joining us tonight. This talk is hosted by the Mojave Project and the Barrick Museum of Art at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Funding for our webinar series is provided by California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Visit calhum.org in order to learn more. This will be our last webinar. We thank you all for spending your evening with us as we close out the series. The last day to view the exhibition of the Mojave Project on view at the Barrick Museum will be this Friday, July 22nd, 2022. Please visit our website at www.unlv.edu/Barrick Museum for more information on upcoming events at the Barrick. At the end of the discussion, we will open the conversation with questions from our audience. Please post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen rather than the chat window. Before we begin tonight's conversation, I would like to say a land acknowledgement. The Mojave Project and the UNLV's Barrick Museum of Art acknowledges the indigenous people of the Mojave Desert, including the Chemehuevi, Mojave, Serrano, Southern Paiute, Timbisha Shoshone, and Western Shoshone, all who continue to occupy and persist throughout this arid region today. We encourage you all to become familiar with the indigenous peoples of the lands you occupy. I'm pleased now to artist and curator Kim Stringfellow.
Thank you everyone for joining us for this final program. It's been really wonderful to have these conversations over the last 4 or 5 months. And this is, I think, going to be a very interesting conversation. I want to introduce you to our speakers tonight. Dr. Barbara Gothard is an artist originally from Illinois who aspires to tap into her creative potential with contemporary art form known for exploring subconscious mind while focusing on the challenge and promise of change. Gothard, who exhibits locally and internationally, lives, works, and is influenced by the ever-changing colors and majesty of the Palm Springs Mojave Desert area. David Nichols is joining us tonight from the Mojave Preserve. He is a Los Angeles native. He works in the field of archaeology since 1990. The first half of his career, he worked on projects throughout the Pacific, including Hawaii, the Northern Mariana Islands, the Marshall Islands, Guam, and Australia. The second half of his career, he worked on projects across California and has worked at the Mojave National Preserve for the National Park Service for the past 22 years. Claytee White is the inaugural director of the Oral History Research Center at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas Libraries. She collects the history of Las Vegas and the surrounding area by gathering memories of events and experiences from longtime residents. Her projects include early healthcare in the city, history of the John S. Park neighborhood, the Boyer Early Las Vegas Oral History Project, and a study of musicians who played with some of the greats in the entertainment field. As one of the 5 founders of the Las Vegas Historical Society, she chronicles the history of Las Vegas's Black community that was established in 1905. Please welcome our speakers tonight virtually. Thank you. And Barbara, you're going to start this evening with your presentation.
Thank you, Kim. My approach to researching the untold stories of 23 African-American homesteaders who settled in the far eastern Mojave Desert in 1910 was non-traditional. First, from my role as a visual artist, and second, from my need to learn as much as I could about them in order to visually interpret their stories. At the beginning of my journey, I did not know what that visual interpretation might look like. I only knew that I felt compelled to do it. So as you may be wondering, as many people have asked, why was I, as a visual artist, motivated to develop this project? The simple answer is that the more I learned about these specific African-American homesteaders, the more I was compelled to bring their stories forward. And although they were not the only African-Americans who settled in California, their untold stories are such an important part of our Mojave Desert history. I was also struck by the idea of what it must have taken for these families to uproot, move across country, and start a totally new life in an unfamiliar environment in 1910, and that they were African Americans. One of my earliest reactions as I delved into the research was the difference between the information available about African American migration, specifically that there's much more information available about south to north migration versus Mideast US and the South to California. And the volume of information about north to south is considerably greater. The pioneer researcher and late founder of the Mojave Desert Heritage and Cultural Association in Goffs, Dennis Casebeer, is thought to be the person to develop the written records and conduct the first oral histories about these specific homesteaders. Dennis was very generous in sharing his findings with me and directing me to others, specifically to David Nichols, and who commissioned an anthropological and ethnological study about these Landfair Dunbar homesteaders, which he generously shared with me. So Contradictions, Bringing the Past Forward, is a visual interpretation of their stories, and it's consistent with the rest of my artworks. The title of the exhibit emanates from my own existence as a contradiction. I'm a contradiction. I'm a woman artist of color living in the desert. All of my artworks are about contradictions, the real versus the surreal. And these homesteaders' lives were also about contradictions. I felt strongly that I wanted to share their stories of hope, disillusionment, and strong family bonds, because I think it's so important for all of us, and our young people in particular, to learn about this untold history of the Mojave Desert. So what got me started on this journey? I call it serendipity. In late 2019, right before COVID hit, I was researching some information about African-American artists in the desert. I read an article by Joe Blackstock in the Inland Daily Bulletin. But what struck me most about his article was this image of an ad from the Los Angeles Herald in May of 1910. And the ad simply says, "An appeal to colored men. The directors of the El Dorado Gold Star Mining Company herewith appeal to the colored men of the entire West to investigate and cooperate with them in developing their vast mineral and agricultural interests in southern Nevada." So that was my introduction to them. And so where did my curiosity lead me? It led me to the Landfair Dunbar migratory process, which differed from most of the other African-American migratory stories, as I mentioned. It was much more complex, varied, multifocal, and multiracial. Most of these homesteaders had already arrived in the greater Los Angeles area. And prior to 1900, due to the exclusionary state laws, applicants were required for homesteads were required to be white. And racist laws were somewhat relaxed at the outset of the 20th century. And in addition to Landfair and Dunbar, there were other African-American intentional communities throughout California. And some of the agricultural settlements throughout the state, one in Fresno, San Bernardino, Tulare, Yolo, and they were formed by African-Americans who had already arrived in California. The oldest of this was Gwynda, California, which is near Sacramento. And Basil Campbell, who was a former slave, as it turned out, when he passed in 1906, he owned close to 5,000 acres of land. And the community of Allensworth is now a state park. Sidewinder Valley near Victorville claimed 30 African-American families in over 20,000 acres. And then there's Landfair and Dunbar. The red dot on this map will give you an idea of where Landfair Dunbar is actually located. And as you'll notice, it's close to Needles. The map on the right-hand side was developed by the Mojave National Project for their study. And the reason I've added this map is because it's a tract map of the size of all of the homesteads that took place in the Landfair Dunbar area. And there were a total of 83 homesteads, but only 23 of them were owned by African Americans. And so the tracts that are in red are the African American owned homesteads. So what was their appeal in moving to California in 1910? Oops, I went the wrong way, sorry. Their appeal to homesteading was their entrepreneurial interest, were mining, water company, farming. Three of the men had founded the gold mine and company that actually placed that ad. And they were interested in generational wealth, land ownership, and being self-supporting. They wanted to avoid the pains of prejudice in the post-Civil War and avoid the challenges of interracial romance, because many of them were in interracial marriages or relationships. And they were linked by way of marriage and religious networks, social organizations, and political organizing. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting was that almost all of them were registered to vote. The requirements for homesteading in 1910 were based upon the law that was signed by President Lincoln on May 20th in 1862. And the applicant had to be 21 years of age, had to have borne no arms against the US, which meant that legally Confederate soldiers were unable to apply for homesteads. The filing fee was $35. They had to prove up in person, which meant that they had to go to a local government office to identify themselves and prove they were the person they said they were. Since several of the homesteaders were former slaves and were illiterate, they would then take someone else with them. One of the requirements was they had to build a house minimum of 10 feet by 10 feet on 160 acres. And 5 years later, the Homestead Act was expanded so they could get an additional 168 acres at $1.25 per acre. They were expected to plant and harvest crops, 10 acres in the first year, 20 in the second, 40 in the third. And one of the things that struck me the most was that whenever these homesteaders opted to leave the land and go into LA for supplies or medical or whatever, they were required to report to the government the day on which they were going to leave, how long they were going to be gone, when they would be back, and the purpose of their trip, which to me and in our environment of being so mobile as a society, that was a fairly restricted process. I thought it would be interesting to explore briefly a snapshot of the demographics of African Americans in the Mojave Desert. In 1850, there were 952. In 1860, it was reported that number had grown to 4,000. And in 1870, there were only 24 African American students who were enrolled in school. And prior to 1910, the percentage of African Americans in this area was 0.1%. In 1910, it grew after 1910, it grew to 22,000 or 38%. And in the latest census, it's listed as between 4 and 5%. So my approach to developing this project of an art installation to tell a history and a humanities program was difficult and challenging, to say the least. The conceptual elements of this project were the most challenging, marrying the stories from the past with a contemporary art form. And since I'm not a figurative painter, that was a bigger challenge. My style, and a friend of mine describes my style of art as if Georgia O'Keeffe married Salvador Dali. It's mystical, it's focused on the subconscious, the real versus the surreal. But it's also about hope, and the openings within my paintings represent the options that we have in life, or the hope. And the fact that I decided that I was going to create 23 artworks, I must admit, was really, really daunting. And the other challenge was, how could I get so much information about them to find space? So I decided that I had to use symbolic elements to, quote, talk visually, unquote, about their lives. And I opted to use archival maps. I import images from that era. Because photos, there were not a lot of photos at that time, and the photos that did exist are of such poor quality, it was hard to use them. And to use images of state flowers to show where they came from to get to California. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to share with you 2 images tonight. This first one is about a man whose name was John Massey. And all of these images were created on my iPad and then printed on raw linen canvas. And I selected raw linen canvas because it's the color of the desert. It's a grayish kind of tannish color. And when it's not treated with gesso or a primer, it has a really rough texture, and that texture comes through even through the printed colors on it. I incorporated maps as a way to tell their migratory stories. And the California poppy is an orangish color. And the raw linen canvas, I didn't want anything that looked really glossy. So I didn't want to frame them, because to me that would have taken away the rustic look. So I created them like scrolls with hems at the top and the bottom. And then you'll see in a minute how they hang like a scroll. And John Massey was born in 1848. He was born in Frederick, Virginia. In 1874, he married Millie Moulton. And in 1912, he was the treasurer of the Eldorado Gold Star Mining Company. And in 1913, he became an incorporator of the Dunbar Water Company. And the reason they formed the water company was because they had to drill down 360 feet in order to reach water that was suitable for cooking and for drinking. And so several of them formed a water company in which they pooled their resources and built a well that they then made the water available to their neighbors. And this is the other image I'm going to share with you. This is Anna Jones. Out of the 23 homesteaders, 7 of them were women who actually filed for homesteads in their own right. And Anna was born in 1872 in Crawford County, Arkansas. She married William Jones in 1889 in Crawford County, Arkansas. And he and she were part of the Gold Star Mining Company, and they also formed an organization called the Harts Township Corporation. They had 6 children. They moved to Landfair in 1910. Their home was 12 feet by 14 feet on a 160-acre tract. Unfortunately, Anna died young. She died in 1915. Her oldest son, Ralph, opted to stay on the homestead, and 3 of the children were handed over to the California Probation Office. And the fellow homesteader, Howard Folk, became a guardian for Lonnie and Marie. And as you will see in this image, you do see the California poppy rather prominently, along with the apple blossom, which was the state flower of Arkansas. And you can see how I used portions and integrated part of the track map into the images. And in order to develop some sort of a feeling of movement and migration, I opted to use that icon of having the size of her particular track extend forward in the artwork with her number on it. And then it's connected down to a 1910 map of the US to the state of Arkansas. These are images of the exhibit itself. The 2 on the top are the title walls as you first walked into the exhibit. It was held at the San Bernardino County Museum in Redlands from February to April. And the 2 at the bottom give you a wider view, and you can see how the scrolls are hung. And the information that I shared with you in that panel about Anna is actually the amount of information, same kind of information, that's included in the title plaque next to each of the scrolls. And to give you an idea of space, the size of this gallery is 2,000 square feet, which was wonderful because it allowed me to be able to hang the scrolls in a way that no matter how many people were in the space, that they could each go up and see them. And then I created on the floor a replica of the map to give you a sense of dimension between where the African-American tracts were versus the others. And although the term intentional community is used, the intentional community here was based upon the fact that one of the patriarchs, 2 of the patriarchs actually, wanted their relatives to live in close proximity, as opposed to being in a segregated or a racially separated environment. The most exciting part, or one of the most exciting parts of the installation is the fact that David and his staff facilitated loaning some of the archaeological objects that they have found at the Landfair Dunbar site to be included in the exhibit. And for me, that just brought the whole thing full circle, because while we can talk about them and their history, but to see actually artifacts that they used and had in their homes was just one of the most thrilling parts of it for me. And I will just mention that the last two images are a Catalina can lid. And the significance of that is that these homesteaders separated their vegetable oil from their animal fat, because several of them were members of the, I just lost the name of it, of the Seventh-day Adventists. Yeah, of the Seventh-day Adventists. I get too excited. Of the Seventh-day Adventist, organization. And that was part of, they were mostly vegetarians. And these were the cases in which we housed the artifact at the exhibit. You can see there's a cast iron pan, actually, that's part of it as well. Another exciting part of the installation is that two of the staff members at ESRI, the Environmental Services Institute Research Institute, Jim Heffries and Doug Morgenthaler, they created a story map, which is interactive, so that you can, and there's a link down below, you can actually go into the story map and trace where they moved from to get to California, and see images of all the other work as well. And just this week, Kim published and posted a dispatch about these African-American homesteaders from the Landfair area. And lastly, I created a blog about it. So if you have any interest in learning more, it goes right back to the beginning. And I will continue to update it as I move along. And the exhibit has moved from campus of the San Bernardino County Museum to Victor Valley Museum in Apple Valley. So with that, I thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. That was great. I'm just posting the link to the dispatch for people to.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker tonight is going to be David Nichols. Thanks.
How are we looking here?
Looks good.
All right, well, Dr. Gothard stole some of my thunder by sharing pictures of artifacts that I am also going to share. So I'm going to share a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how this project came together, how it came about, why it persists to be. Of course, it's in Lanfair Valley. All the photographs you'll see are from that part of Mojave National Preserve. Let's see here. So first I have to figure out how to make this work. Here we go. So this was a map that you saw Dr. Gothard share. This is a map that has existed before this study was ever conceived of. We knew that there was a pretty well documented history of homesteading in the Landfair Valley, but this map used to all be blue parcels because we weren't aware of a African-American constituency out there. So the boxes that are red now have only come out after the study was completed. And I say completed because we've gotten to a point now where we have enough information to build upon. Who's this fellow and what's he doing sitting on the front step of one of my archaeological ruins, which happens to be the Landfair School? And is he in this photograph, which is actually a period photograph from 1910 of the Landfair School? And who are these people? And why do they own property to this day out there in Lanfair Valley? So as Dr. Gothard had brought up, Dennis Casebeer, an avocationalist historian who created the Mojave Desert Heritage and Cultural Association in the mostly abandoned town of Goffs, which is on our southeast corner of Mojave National Preserve. He ran into these folks and they were up in Landfair Valley. And that's not a heavily visited part of the Mojave National Preserve. He asked them if they were lost, what they were up to, and they spoke to a couple generations of family members speaking of living in the desert and paying property taxes on these properties. And they didn't know what they were or where they were, and they were looking for them. And of course, it piqued his interest. And from there, he moved forward and started oral interviews with family members. And those collections are there at the Mojave Desert Heritage and Cultural Association and are open for research. For me, I watched this thing start to take off. Once word got out, here's an article that Casebeer wrote for Mojave National Preserve for our newspaper. Here's one Chris Clark wrote for KCET, our PBS affiliate in Los Angeles. So little articles are starting to get published here and there in different publications and words getting out. And I'm like, how do I get a hold on this thing? I don't have any money and it's a bigger story and I know there's more to it. Well, in 2015, 2016, there was an internal funding initiative called the National Park Service Civil Rights Commemoration Initiative for studying African Americans in national parks. And I went, God, this is my perfect opportunity. Like nobody's gonna believe that this story exists in the California desert, much less in Mojave National Preserve. And I wrote a compelling project proposal, and I got $250,000 for this. And what do you get for $250,000? 2 cultural anthropologists and 1 archaeologist. And this archaeologist here in the middle of the cultural anthropologist, he comes for free because he's paid out of salary by the National Park Service. So the idea of the project was to do the ethnography, the cultural anthropological study first, and with that data, go after the archaeology. And then the third part of that was to marry the two into a single report. So the anthropologists went first, and they started off with interviewing some of those same people that Dennis Casebeer had run into and going through family photographs and asking about grandpa's memories and grandma's memories and what the family knows about how they were subsisting out there. The Hodnett family were kind of the main movers and shakers out there, but a lot of the other homesteaders were they all knew each other. They were all associated. Another part of what they had to do, which archaeologists don't necessarily do, we don't usually have time to, was go to the National Archives, go to the Huntington museums, go to various libraries. I'm not sure if they went to UNLV or not, but there's an extensive bibliography of the research institutes that they did go to. And they go through records, painstakingly so. They found all the homestead entries. They found canceled entries. They chased down who the names of the people that actually lived out there, their associates, their business partners, and that was their job. They also found lots of great photographs. And this is what one of those homesteads looked like. This is, what Dr. Gothard talked about, 10 by 10 or some variants thereof, 10 by 10 being the minimum size. That's what they would have looked like then. This is what they look like now. Almost universally, they all look like this. They're collapsed in place. It doesn't look like much to the untrained eye, but to an archaeologist, this looks wonderful. I mean, you can see the outline of the house. Artifacts are in place here. Most recently, the last time I went out was about a month ago. I found an 1875 penny in the middle of one of these things. This is a page taken out of our archaeological document. What we did was we read the ethnographic report went out to the sites that were located, matched up what we found there with what we expected to find from the ethnography. So in many cases, here's using some old maps and transcribing modern tract images over them. This is an example of an artifact. I didn't know what it was. We didn't know what it was. It turned out to be a hat pin, a late Victorian century hat pin. And if you look at photographs from that time period, some of those hats are gigantic and worn askance, and some of those hairdos are pretty fantastical. And you needed these big hat pins to keep those hats on. This was something Dr. Gothard brought up, the Seventh-day Adventist connection. Those coddling can lids, they were found over and over and over again at several different homesteads, Black homesteads. When we went and surveyed the neighboring white homesteads that weren't affiliated with this group, you didn't find any of these coddling cans because they weren't part of that group. And this is one of those organizations that came together in Los Angeles and came out as a group and brought others with them. So this is the archaeology speaking to the ethnography, to what the cultural anthropologists found in the literature we're finding on the ground physically. Here's that nice brooch, Georgia Edwards brooch. I can't remember her story exactly, but I remember when we found this, we were excited, and we had to go back and see if she was a fancy lady. This actually is an interesting story. The Baker homestead was I believe an 8-year-old and 6-year-old boy lived here, and their mother left them there with either an uncle or a grandfather nearby to kind of watch over them. And we read that, and we went out and we surveyed, and we found children's clothing articles and marbles and toys, which spoke to, the residents of young children there. So again, the archives speak to photographs of what was there in the time period, and then the photograph on the right is one taken by my archaeologists that worked out on the site. Same orientation, and that's what remains of it. Interestingly, when we walked around the schoolyard, a piece of chalk from the period was still on the ground. I don't know what they make chalk out of. I guess chalk, but for it to last 100 years on the ground was pretty remarkable. So one of the things that came out of this study was our listing as an archive in the African American Civil Rights Network. There's a link right there at the bottom of the page that's specific to us, but it'll get you to the larger African American Civil Rights Network website. And it took some doing to get listed on there. We got listed as an archive, not as a site, because to get listed as a site, they were looking more at sort of latter 20th century civil rights movement. And we speak more to the generation before that. So we're listed as an archive though, which is pretty cool. And my last slide here is how we're moving forward. So ours is a very small story in a much larger picture that Dr. Gothard referenced, which is the movement from the Midwest to the Southwest of these people. And we have a student, Austin Schoenkopf, who is doing this as his PhD dissertation at Montana State University. And he's coming up with a whole heck of a lot more information for us. And he's going to fit the story into the larger context, which is important. That's where this study should continue to go. And that's what I have.
Great, thanks. Thank you. And I can see that Austin is actually one of the participants tonight. So it'd be great if you have questions or something you want to state. So our next speaker is Claytee White. I'm going to go ahead and mute.
I think I was muted. So I am the director of the Oral History Research Center, and the work that we've done in Las Vegas is just completely different from the work that the two of you have done. And I'm just so impressed with that work. Here in the Las Vegas Valley, the first African Americans showed up. They were, the man named John Howell was in the 1870 census. And we know about him because he owned property here in Las Vegas. And those property records tell us about him. And today, because he owns some property in an area today that we call Springs Preserve, where the water was found at that time, he owned property in that area. And today they are doing lots and lots of research about him. I am not sure I know how to get to my next slide. What do I press?
You can use your arrow keys if you'd like to go forward or backward on the keyboard.
Oh, good. That doesn't work.
Let's see. Click on the slide or
Okay.
Great.
So Las Vegas actually started in 1905 when the railroad came through. And as you know, at that time, this was the way that it connected, we began to connect the country. As early as 1904, the tracks were laid between San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake City. They needed a place in between, a place in the desert that they could build a city. And that place became Las Vegas. They wanted water, ice for the produce on the trains, and they wanted a settlement because people had to repair those trains. So that's why Las Vegas is here today. J.T. McWilliams was the person who surveyed the property that was sold to the railroad. This surveyor worked here in 1904. Helen J. Stewart, one of the females, it's wonderful that we're talking about females in some of this. The property that the railroad purchased for Las Vegas was owned by a woman, Helen J. Stewart. Her husband had been murdered early on, and this was the surveyor, J.T. McWilliams, who was hired to survey the property. He laid out a town site in 1904. That town site was laid out west of the tracks, where the water was. And someone else mentioned water and the value of water here in this desert environment. When the owners of the railroad, the Williams brothers, came through in 1905, they said, downtown is going to be east of the tracks. But they owned the rights to the water. And that's why they were very, very successful. J.T. McWilliams did not own the rights. So the people who had purchased property from J.T. McWilliams resettled across the tracks, east of the tracks. And this is what early Las Vegas looked like. Block 17 was the area where African Americans were told to live. And so that became the area of the city where African Americans lived. People who owned the railroad, controlled the railroad, looked like this, wore these kind of suits in the desert, can you imagine? But this is what early Las Vegas was like. So Block 17 today looks like this. African Americans began to move out of the downtown area around 1930. At that time, the Hoover Dam had been the federal government in 1928 said that the Hoover Dam would be built. Great Depression, 1929, 1930, the first men were hired to build the Hoover Dam. So people began to move out of the heart of downtown Las Vegas. Whites moved to the east, farther to the east, and Blacks were told to move across the tracks to the west, where that old development was that the surveyor had laid out, because Block 17 became the first federal building in the area. It became a post office on the first floor and a courthouse on the second floor. This building, of course, is historically preserved today. So that was the beginning of Las Vegas. In 1925, there had been a march of the Ku Klux Klan down the main street, Fremont Street. So as jobs began to tighten, racism began to show more and more evidence here in the West. And in 1928, the same time that the Hoover Dam is declared, African Americans in Las Vegas who have migrated here from the very beginning of the town started a branch of the NAACP. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People had started in New York in 1909, and they felt that they just might need help because of the way the racial situation was changing in a very, very powerful way. Women were very, very important in this early town. And we see the founding members of the NAACP included 2 Black women. And I find that very interesting because it meant you had to have the money to put together to start a branch of the NAACP. And we have 2 women who were entrepreneurs at the same time, and they were able to invest in a new town. Schools at this time were integrated. Early on, just one school, everybody went to the same school. Then as Blacks moved across the tracks to the west and whites began to move to the east, schools became segregated. And then later on in history, as the courts got involved, that the school system later on were reintegrated. And of course, today they're almost segregated again. So Hoover Dam was a point of the Great Migration to this area. Not the Great Migration of Blacks so much as the migration of people to this area. 1930, 1929, the Great Depression had started and people wanted jobs. So they began to migrate here as soon as they heard that there was going to be a federal project. These people slept in tents and shacks and wherever they could near that dam site early on. So in 1930, they hired the first round of men to work on the Hoover Dam. Can you imagine after all that time, now you have a federal job and people, everybody wants those jobs. The first 1,000 men were hired in 1930, even though the work on the dam did not begin until 1931. Those first 1,000 men were all white. And that was the reason then that more and more agitation and protests began by the NAACP, trying to make this a place that would hire African Americans along with the other men that were working in projects. And this project, the Hoover Dam, out of all the New Deal projects, were one of the most successful because they paid so well. The technology was superb. They had over 20,000 men who worked on the Hoover Dam over the 4-year period. And out of that number, there were only 44 Blacks. Now, the Bureau of Reclamation has done some more recent research, and they're finding that maybe the number was smaller. But we get this number from research that was done early on during this time period. So right now I'm sticking with 44. I just cannot believe there could have been less. But Boulder City was a city that was built by the federal government to house the workers on the Hoover Dam. And Boulder City did not allow African Americans to live there. So because of that, African American men had to drive back and forth to the dam every day, where the people who lived in Boulder City were only 6 miles away from the site, and they were taken back and forth by transportation provided by the federal government. So we see the beginnings of systemic racism in the town. But also Hoover Dam is like the 8th wonder of the world. So not only do we see this beginning of racism in a more hardened fashion, but we see the beginning of tourism. Tourism that keeps Las Vegas alive starts because of the Hoover Dam. So this marvel, everybody wants to see it. And now the family car becomes more and more popular, and people are beginning to drive, especially from Southern California, coming to Las Vegas. And so our tourism industry, most people thinks it started because of gaming. And yes, gaming becomes a very, very important part of it. But the Hoover Dam, this 8th wonder of the world, is what begins to bring tourists to our area of the world. I'm going to stop now, but I have to tell you that I'm not going to end on the note that only 44 African Americans were hired. I want to tell you about the next federal project here. World War II starts in 1941, as you know, and there is a process used to build war implements, and that was manganese ore had to be processed to build this guns, bullets, airplanes, rifles. Germany already had the technology. We were late getting into the war, and we did not have the technology yet. So Basic Magnesium Incorporated was formed. And this company, federal government again, brings in a lot of Black migrants from the South, from small towns like Fordyce, Arkansas, and Tallulah, Louisiana. And these people work at Basic Magnesium Incorporated. And this time, 2 housing developments were constructed. Carver Park, where African Americans lived, designed by Paul Williams, the famed architect from Los Angeles, and Victory Village, where the white workers lived. So I'm going to stop right there with this migration. Stop on a high note. These jobs brought to us, this migration brought people from all walks of life here. African Americans came who were professionals. We already had an entrepreneurial class from the early days, but now we get more and more entrepreneurs moving here. And this factory, Basic Magnesium Incorporated, gives us our first state senator. Joe Neal comes from Tallulah, Louisiana, and eventually becomes the first state senator in Nevada. Joe Neal served 32 years, and his daughter is serving as a state senator right now. So I'll stop on a high note. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to help answer some of them.
Thank you, Claytee. I just want to share my screen because I've been working on a piece that's about water in the Mojave Desert, focused on the Colorado River. And this is such a wonderful photograph. And I was shocked to learn that there were just, less than what you say 44, but I think I had that and let's see, is this thing in the way? Okay. but I just really like the expressions and everything on these men that are working there. So this is from the National Archives.
And is this the Hoover Dam?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I think this is one of they're working on the penstock over here, maybe. Or one of the coffer dams, you know, below. So I would like to open it up for questions, unless we want to begin, if the three of you have any questions for each other, and then we can see. And we have a manageable group. So if any of you would like to ask a question in person, part of the audience, if you raise your virtual hand, and that's going to be at the bottom of the Zoom screen, I can see that you're requesting, and you can ask a question yourself rather than posting it in the Q&A. Is there anything that you wanted to ask one another, or?
I'm curious about the magnesium company. Does it still exist there?
No, it was in operation throughout the war. And then it was closed down because it was no longer needed for the products that they were producing. They were all war implements, but a lot of men got jobs at other plants that grew up around that same area. But Basic Magnesium, if you know Basic High School, this was the beginning of the city of Henderson, which is the second largest city now in the state of Nevada. So that's how it started.
Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
And
I know an artist from Darwin who is a self-taught artist that I photographed for Mojave projects, and Monty worked at Basic Magnesium, among a lot of other jobs throughout the Mojave Desert. So
Yeah.
I've been interested in learning more about it. So this was wonderful.
Yeah.
So
And David, I was just going to ask if you could share with us a little bit more about the study, because you're going into the third phase of it, you said?
So the third phase is compiling the ethnographic study and the archaeological study, which reside as two separate independent reports now. And I think, and maybe our graduate student is actually on this call. He may want to speak more to what his efforts are. But I'm sort of letting him take the reins as part of his PhD dissertation. Austin, if you're on this call, maybe you'd like to tell us where you're headed with this.
Okay, he raised his hand. So Stacy raised hand first. So I'm going to start with Stacy and then Austin. Okay, so.
Thanks, David.
Okay, so Stacy, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm curious to have a better picture in my mind of what the Lanfair Valley community looked like. It doesn't sound like we had a village going. It sounds like a very loose association of people. What was the total population out there? I guess everybody had cars. I'm gathering they were not associated with Los Angeles, so they didn't go there to buy their wood. It sounds like our town might have been Las Vegas even that early on. And yeah, I'm wondering about trips to town for supplies. Sounds like almost a, it's a kind of a frontier log cabin community going on here. Yeah, I'm wondering like, okay, so we had a school. Can anybody kind of fill in a little better for me? I don't have a clear understanding of how it was working and how they were interacting with the white settlers. Oh, and I'm also curious, were they working in the mines? I actually own a mine in the East Mojave that dates to 1907, and I'm curious who would have been down those 300-foot shafts.
Yeah, so I'll handle that one, Stacy. A branch of the Santa Fe Railroad bisected that community. And in fact, they all were tied to Los Angeles. And for any vegetables or ice or things that they needed beyond what they were growing themselves, they would send orders to Ralph's grocery in Los Angeles, and weekly vegetables would come in with ice on that train. They also used that same supply line to ship out things that were successful crops, such as they were growing peaches, and they had Milo maize, and they had sorghum and watermelons and a bunch of other stuff. And it tended to be the Black communities were interspersed amongst the whites. It tended to be families that would match up their homestead parcels to next to each other so they could help each other with their harvests. So when we go out there in present day and do the archaeological surveys, when you find one homestead, you know the other three are just right, within 100 yards of you, because you're at a quarter section, and all the families would settle next to each other, but on their own parcels. The mining effort, I know it didn't really play out that much for us. I don't think many of them were involved. There were people that were involved in that that mining enterprise that was up in by Searchlight, but I don't think they were using any of the Landfair community. Actually, Austin knows a lot more about some of this stuff, and he could probably speak better to it.
Okay. Thanks, David. Thanks, Stacy, for your question. Austin I'm going to allow you to talk.
Hi, friends. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Thanks. So yeah, the fun part about this project is there are infinite directions to go in. I think that some of the things I want to look at here for my dissertation are, as you all have spoken to, this idea that the Western migration that immediately preceded the Great Migration and went into it is a really distinctive story that we have to recognize in our national history. So tying Black farming communities, and especially homesteading communities that make use of interesting developments in both technology and land policy to find these levels of security and independence, that's just such a distinctively strong story to follow. But there's also these questions about what makes, especially the East Mojave, where Lanfair Valley is located, what makes these places so distinctive? We all understand what it's like to live in a desert. That's why we love it out here in many ways, but we also understand the challenges that presents. So trying to think about how the environmental conditions in many ways shaped and reformed these people who were coming out with their very own, or very strong, I should say, cultural and community ties. That's something really worth investigating. I think there's a lot to be said about economic battles still, like what is the racial dynamic of the old homesteader versus rancher fight that we hear about so often. These are just some of the things that I hope to explore a bit more fully. I think it would be fun to look at Lanfair Valley, which is such a distinctive and special place, and think about how that might connect to these other places like in the Tulare Basin, Blackdom, New Mexico, if you're going to look at a Rocky Mountain comparison. But there's something really distinctive about Black migration into the Southwest and the use of knowledge attained through generations defined by slavery and the legacy of slavery. Like we can't shy away from that. So that's what, to be brief, that's where I'm looking to do it. But I do have this question that I have for you all. In a region that we all understand to be very rugged, between the aridity and the topography, we know it is a tough place to form one community, let alone connect communities. So how do you all see connectivity within the Mojave Desert in the way that you tell your stories? Could you speak a bit to that?
So just to make just an introductory point to that, When I showed you the first African-American person in the Las Vegas area, John Howell, he was also a miner in the El Dorado Canyon and a freighter.
Oh.
And that history is being gathered now. So the interconnections are just so broad and so vivid. We're talking about people who came out of slavery. And for them to live in a desert and be independent and own some land, come on, they can do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would like to see Austin, you know, I feel like there's a lot of possibility for expanding this. Say, you know, we know in Apple Valley, Murray's Dude Ranch was out there. There was a history prior to Murray's in the 1930s. That's likely the reason that they had gone out there, because we talked about the Sidewinder Valley. And so I'm wondering if there can be some connections between like really looking at, you know, genealogy and all these different things to see how people were kind of moving in and out through there. And maybe even in the far western Mojave Desert too, Lancaster, Palmdale area, you know. So I think this is a really rich history that I'm really excited about. And, you know, in the beginning of working on the Mojave project, I had found Dennis's, you know, essay that was in, you know, you showed that, David, and that was the only thing that was available, you know, and I talked a bit with Dennis when he was alive about it, so I was able to get more information. So having come across Barbara's work, you know, I'm just so excited that there's energy, you know, there's these archaeological studies, all these things that are happening, and maybe we're going to learn more and make more of these connections.
And Austin, back to your question. My understanding is, and David can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that the miners, the owners who placed that ad, one of their original ideas was to create a Tuskegee Institute West. And that they had actually gone to Alabama and met with the Tuskegee Institute folks there to find out and to figure out how to create a similar kind of program by bringing together the agriculture aspects of it, the mining, the engineering. The only difference was in Alabama, everything grows easily. And it doesn't, that isn't the same, you know, in the Landfair Dunbar area. But my understanding is that that was very much part of their motivation. Well, and they met with George Washington Carver actually to be able to learn how to go about setting up, you know, a Tuskegee Institute West.
I think you're very much right there. I also think there's some interesting nuance about this project happening, this farming project going on, these communities forming at the same time that the Campbell method, or what they call dry land farming, you know, we know dry land farming now, but when this was really a innovative and new way to look at Western spaces. So there's something about the distinctive Black experience that happens there and the debates within that, those schools of thought, but also seeing it tie into this, like this national project of land reform, something about law reshaping people's lives who have in many ways whose lives have in many ways been defined by the prejudice and violence faced by themselves or their ancestors. So there's something about those things interacting that's really worth holding on to.
So Barbara, is that Booker T. Washington or Carver?
That was Carver, George Washington Carver.
Okay.
Yeah, and Austin, you said earlier, make use of the knowledge gained by the effect of the aftermath of racism. I'm not quite sure what you meant by that.
I don't mean that so much. I mean, Judith Carney, Mart Stewart, and others have written that in many ways, the agricultural labor that was forcibly learned by enslaved Africans and people of African descent in many ways influenced later patterns of agricultural practice. So for example, in Kansas and Nicodemus, many of the farming practices were in many ways mimicking or reusing knowledge that had been learned in the South, albeit under enslavement, and had been instead co-opted as like a sign of land-based empowerment. I think what's distinctive here in the Mojave is that they're practicing a type of farming that in many ways divorces from that previous legacy of cultural knowledge.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, I'd like to learn more and to understand that better. So, but thank you.
So before we end the program, I just wanted to open it up if there were anyone else that would like to ask a question to the group, or any other comments from our presenters.
I have one more comment. I think that we owe David a big debt of gratitude for taking the steps to enable that study to get started and everything that's emanated from that, because that kind of vision doesn't come along often in a lifetime. And the fact that you recognized an opportunity and you made it happen, which enables all the rest of us to talk about this today. So I think we all owe you a big debt of gratitude.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And also the fact that you came down with COVID this week and you're here now. So
This is the only thing I'm doing this week.
Be able to present, but you're here, so we really appreciate that. It's wonderful, and I hope at some point there will be a display maybe in the preserve where we can, people can learn about this and actually see some of the artifacts,
Yeah, we plan on that, absolutely. And we have Dr. Gothard speaking with our interp staff, and we're working on stuff.
Yeah.
Great.
This is just the beginning.
It kind of is. Turned into a real monster.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you so much with our speakers tonight. I've been learning so much through interacting with all three of you, and I want to keep the conversation going and looking forward to more things that are revealed as different research, and this is wonderful. So I'm sure Dennis would be happy too about this. So,
And thank you, Kim, for organizing us for tonight.
Yeah, thank you for participating. So, so we're going to go ahead and end the call tonight. Let me just check. Oh, Carl, let me just see. I know Carl. There was there's one question. Were there any African-American were any in the African-American community able to take advantage of the early growth of the gaming industry in Las Vegas? And that sounds like something Claytee.
Yes, so the African-American community in Las Vegas was completely segregated by the time that gaming started. In the African-American community that we know today of as the historic West Side, that's the area that's west of the tracks, there were a number, we have a whole list of small gaming cocktail lounges and nightclubs. They didn't have hotels attached, but they had gaming in the African-American community in a really vibrant way. Entertainers who came here to entertain in the Stardust and all of the other big hotels that started, especially those starting in the 40s. those entertainers had to live in boarding houses on the west side. That community, that Black community became very, very vibrant, filled with all kinds of nightlife. And yes, African Americans were able to obtain gaming license and had very, very successful businesses. We probably have a list of about 22 various gaming locations in and around Jackson Avenue, which was the business corridor on the west side. And then, of course, 1955, we get the Moulin Rouge, the first integrated upscale casino and hotel that could rival any of those on the Las Vegas Strip. So yes, but Blacks did not own the Moulin Rouge, but Blacks did own lots of the other smaller casinos and nightclubs.
Yeah, I loved looking at those photographs from the Moulin Rouge. It seemed like that was a really great venue for nightlife and music and entertainment. Just looks, and are there archives, or I know the building, like most of these casinos, it's long gone, but do they have in the library?
Yes, yes, we have photographs, we have oral histories. So yes, you can come in and learn about some of these clubs that I'm talking about today. And you can go online as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And if you are in Las Vegas and you have a chance to stop by tomorrow evening, I will be in Las Vegas for the closing events. And I'd love to see you. So I don't have anything, just kind of casual talking about the show. We're going to be de-installing over the weekend, so I'll be there tomorrow night. Okay.
Wow, okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.